So I'm a reader in genetics. The microphone stand is going down. I'm a reader in genetics, and I am British, and I'm white. Yeah, I know, it sounds like this is what you're going to share with us next. Is he proud of that as well? How's it going? I'm telling you that because I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea of filling out forms, and there's little tick boxes, and we always have to fill in, that's fair enough, we have to fill in our nationality, but then we have to fill in a little box that represents our skin colour. And we think, well, why skin colour? I mean, humans vary in lots of different ways. There are genes that control what shape your teeth will be, or how thick your follicles will be. I have earwax. I can drink milk without experiencing painful and explosive diarrhea. But there's never a box for that. Although I do often fill in at the bottom of the form, it says room, just to make sure I'm sharing the information correctly. Now obviously I'm being disingenuous. I know why those boxes talk about skin colour, because skin colour is a proxy for race. So the question is, why is there a category for race then? And that's an important question if you're a geneticist, because we've known for decades that race doesn't really represent the sorts of categories that you might build based on human genetics. In fact, it's a very poor representative of that. So why do we still have these racial categories? Why is there still race? And I guess cynically you might say, well, there's probably still race so that we can have racism. But I'm not Jeremy Clarkson, I'm an academic. So that's not really a good enough answer. So I did a bit of research, and I discovered some quite interesting facts. And really, to understand why we have race, or in fact the racial categories that we're used to today, what you have to do is go back and read the writings of a certain German who had very defined ideas about race. Not that one. I'm not talking about Mein Kampf. The person I'm talking about is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Now, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was writing around the end of the 18th century. He was very interested in race, and he was the person that came up with the racial categories that we're familiar with today. He also collected human skulls. He had 60 of them in his collection. And you think, German historian, German scientist from history, interested in collecting human skulls and wants to categorize humans on the basis of race. That's not necessarily going to end well. But you'd be wrong, because Blumenbach was actually astonishingly non-racist, even by our own standards. So Blumenbach's interest came because he was a pupil of Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, who went about naming all living things. And so he picked up from what Linnaeus was doing and set about categorizing all of the humans in terms of different racial groups, and he came up with 5 racial groups that most of them we're familiar with today. So he came up with Caucasian, so Europeans, some Middle Eastern people, some North Africans, Mongoloid, which is essentially all of East Asia, Malayans, largely India and Pakistan, the Americans, Americans from South and North America, and then Ethiopians, which is essentially sub-Saharan Africa. But what he wrote quite extensively is, I have categorized all of humanity, but what's very important, let me emphasize, this is very important, all of these peoples are equivalent. Now, he was writing about morals because that was really important in the 18th century. So he said everybody was morally equivalent, but he also said they were mentally equivalent. And in fact, he went so far as to ridicule some European countries, saying they hadn't produced anywhere near the level of scholarship or the quality of writers that Africa had done at the end of the 18th century. Okay? So he even had some sort of rather modern ideas as well. So his view was that the reason why people were different was because of their circumstances. So, for instance, people that lived in sub-Saharan Africa had darker skins because of sunlight, because they're exposed to sunlight. That's pretty much the reason you would give today. Okay, he had some very bizarre views as well. So, for instance, he noted that the Chinese had paler skin than most of other what he classified as mongoloid races, and he put that down to the fact that they lived in lots of towns. Essentially, Blumenbach was being the equivalent of your parents saying, you need to stop playing video games and get out into the sun more. Now, the sad thing about this is that Blumenbach, as I said, wrote extensively that he was not building a way of saying which races were superior. But Blumenbach was a monogenist. It sounds slightly dodgy, but what all it meant was that he believed that all of humans were part of one species. That's where things started to go wrong. Because if he was going to build his thesis properly, he had to work out an origin point. Essentially for him, Adam and Eve. So where did all the people in the world come from? And that's where things start getting unstuck. So in order to do this, he had to work out, okay, so essentially what skin colour did Adam and Eve have? And he said, well, white. Now his rationale was simply, it's probably harder, it's much easier for pale skin to become darker than it is the other way around. Turns out he was wrong, but still. He wasn't trying to build up any racial supremacy story, at least. And then he wanted to place that origin in terms of geography, and so this is where he used his skulls. So he had a particular, out of the 60 skulls, he had a favourite skull that he thought was the most beautiful of all the skulls that he owned. And this skull came from a lady, or belonged to a lady when she was alive, who lived in Georgia, not the US state, the country. And he said, this is the most beautiful skull, and I think the people of Georgia are the most beautiful. So therefore the ancestors of humanity came from Georgia and they were white. Okay? And that's sort of what he left us with. Now, essentially what Blumenbach wrote, because he stressed the moral equivalence, essentially he prefigured what Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney wrote in their hit in 1982, Ebony and Ivory. He essentially wrote the 18th century version of that. Unfortunately, all of his contemporaries and the people that came after him ignored all of that stuff, said, oh yeah, there's 5 races and the white one's the best. And that's really where everything proceeded. It got worse because then evolution came along and that provided a framework. Although it should be pointed out, Darwin in his book didn't mention humans at all. So the origin of species through natural selection, or as it was called, the preservation of the favoured races in the struggle for life. So he does use race, but unfortunately the races that Darwin was talking about were cabbages. Anybody who's tried to read Darwin, you always get told you should read Darwin, it's really important. If you try and read Darwin, you'll know that he really liked brassicas and pigeons. So many pigeons. So this then brings us really to the sort of time period that we're more familiar with, the rise of genetics. So genetics comes along, and essentially, ever since then, people have been using genetics as an excuse for their own prejudices. The father of genetics, Francis Galton, probably the worst offender, he coined the term eugenics and advocated its development. And this is how things have proceeded throughout the remainder of the 19th century up to the 20th century. So clearly this is something that we still need to struggle with. So where are we genetically in terms of human diversity? Well, we know that humans, unlike Blumenbach, he was wrong, there was a single origin point, but it's in Africa. Okay? A fact that was emphasized by Shakira in her 2010 World Cup anthem, Waka Waka. There's a lyric in that, or at least I thought there was a lyric in that, which went something along the lines of, we're all African. I think that's great, Shakira really understands population genetics. Unfortunately, that line isn't we're all Africa. Isn't we're all African, it's we are all Africa. Which makes less sense and suggests that she's confused population genetics with plate tectonics. But still, I think the sentiment is still there. So, we're all African, or at least our species originated in Africa, and The two closely related organisms to us, closely related animals, are all also African. They never left Africa, the chimpanzees and the gorillas. And it's instructive to compare ourselves to those two species, because it tells us something that we almost didn't make it as a species. So what I want to do to illustrate this point is to call for 3 volunteers. Now, I should emphasise, you should be quite happy wearing a party tiara, okay, and blowing up a balloon. So if you don't feel that you can do either of those things, brilliant, there's one volunteer. Please come up. Give her a round of applause. Go at the back, please, come on up. Give a round of applause. And just looking for one more volunteer, please. Come on, it's just a party tiara. Come on, great. Round of applause, please. Right. Okay, so, just, what's your name, please? Anchor. Okay, Anchor, can you put on the chimpanzee tiara? You just... That's where you go? Just like that. It's like the Statue of Liberty sort of thing. No, it's not enough. You'll need to have your mouth free, so... There you go, just like that.
Well, that is just gorgeous.
What's her name? Catherine. You got your gorilla. And what's her name? Christiana. I know that, of course, but still. So you get the representative of humanity. I chose Donald Trump because of his humanity, obviously, which is evident all the time, plus also the fact that his skin colour has nothing to do with his genetics. Right, so what I want each of you to do, I'm going to give you a balloon, okay, and I want you to blow up the balloon one at a time. So if we start with the chimpanzee, start blowing up the balloon, and I'll tell you when to stop, and this is going to represent the amount of genetic diversity in all of the chimpanzees. Do we have first aid in case somebody
I'm just looking. They all seem very healthy to me.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, keep going. I think it goes a bit long. We don't want to burst the chimpanzees' population genetics. But okay, stop. See if you can tie that up. That's only another exercise in public. And if the person gorilla can... Wow, that's...
That is impressive.
Yeah, keep going. Okay, stop. It's actually quite easy because the genetic diversity between the two species is about the same, so there's no scientific precision whatsoever. Now, if you can stop, Christiana. And stop. Can you let a bit of air out of it? Yeah, perfect. So that represents, so if you hold up your balloons, these are the genetic diversities of all of chimpanzees, all of the gorillas, and this is us, okay? We're completely depauperate. Okay, thank you very much. You can, if you want to take your tiaras away with you, that's fine. So what's happened? Well, we don't actually know, but something really catastrophic happened. After we separated away from the chimpanzees, our closest relatives, we doodled along for quite a while, and then something cataclysmic happened to us, and we barely made it out, okay, of that extinction event. What was left gradually repopulated, grew up around Africa, spread out through Africa, and then about 50,000 years ago, a group of individuals moved out of Africa, had sex with the existing human species, the Neanderthals and Denisovans, which were already there, and then carried on expanding out around the world. And the rest, as they say, is history, or rather prehistory. And it's that movement which we can track in everybody's genomes. And all of you here will have some Neanderthal in your genomes, thanks to those horrendous events. I'm sure they were horrendous as humans moved out and had sex with lots of Neanderthals. We call them euphemistically introgressions. So that's the reason why we have limited genetic diversity. But how is that diversity spread? Well, the most striking thing is that most of the genetic diversity is between individuals within a population. 90% or more of the diversity of human diversity is between individuals. Only a small fraction, about 4 to 5%, is diversity between populations. Okay, the things that makes populations, say, in Europe different than populations in Africa. So that's quite astounding, and that's one of the reasons why we think race has no real bearing, has no real biological bearing. And a good example of that is sickle cell anemia. In the US, sickle cell anemia is often labelled as an African American disease. But that's implying that sickle cell anemia is a racial disease. Okay? It's nothing to do with race, it's to do with ancestry. Your skin colour is irrelevant. If your ancestors trace back to a part of Africa where malaria is endemic, that explains why you might have inherited the sickle cell anemia disorder today. But if you come from a part of Africa where there is no malaria, then you won't have sickle cell anemia. Okay? So what that emphasises more than anything else is it's not race that's important, it's ancestry. And ancestry is the thing that we should be promoting. So I think, to sum up, it's quite sobering. Remember that Blumenbach was writing about the equivalences between the different populations that he studied in 1795. Okay? We've still got those tick boxes. So we've still got some way to go before we reach the point where Blumenbach was proposing humanity needed to be. Thank you.
Right, before we throw the floor open to questions, there's just something I want to ask you right now. So the chimpanzee the girls have got massive diversity, and we don't.
Yeah.
So if we had diversity, do you think there would be not races but different human beings with different skills? This is the international line for different skills. So,
right. Yes.
Yeah, like climbing up trees and stuff like that.
Well, the one that I get asked by school children the most is, will our thumbs change size so that we can use mobile phones better?
Right.
And you think, well, in order for that to happen, there has to be variability in thumb size. Well, there probably is, right? That variability has to be heritable. Probably is.
Right.
But here's the key thing. Being able to text faster has to give you a reproductive advantage. It might.
I'm still out there. I have to come to the end of evolution as I go. It's showing your nice flow, I'll shuffle off. So